The story begins with a photograph, square, faded around the edges, taken on a bright afternoon sometime in June 1964. The kind of picture that once lived on a family mantel, then in a shoebox, then somewhere deeper, until it became more memory than object. The girl in the photograph stands barefoot on a patch of Michigan grass, her posture relaxed, her smile small but certain, like she understood the camera and trusted the person behind it. Her name was Lydia Mae Wallace, 17, the kind of girl neighbors described as polite, quiet, and almost too gentle for this world. The photograph is silent, yet there's something alive in it. Sunlight rests on her shoulders, catching strands of her brown hair as the wind pushes it behind her ears. Her dress is simple, cotton, pale, patterned with flowers that time has nearly erased. A dog sits at her feet, looking somewhere beyond the camera, distracted by a world only animals understand. And behind her, the small Wallace home, modest and square, with paint that had begun to peel long before this picture was taken. Everything seems ordinary, pleasant, familiar, yet the longer one stares, the more the stillness begins to feel unnatural. Like this girl is frozen just seconds before something changed. Her expression hints at a story she never got to tell. People like to believe photographs protect us, that as long as an image exists, the moment captured cannot be lost. But this one carries the opposite feeling. It feels like evidence, proof that someone who existed, who breathed, who dreamed, simply vanished. Before Lydia disappeared, the photograph meant almost nothing. It was just one of many taken that summer. A mother saving memories of a daughter she assumed would always be close. A father who rarely smiled unless a camera forced the corners of his mouth upward. A family that could not imagine how quickly the world would shift beneath their feet. But after the disappearance, this single image became everything. When her name first reached the newspapers, local girl missing, it appeared beside this photo. It sat on bulletin boards, in drugstores, on the walls of diners and gas stations. People pinned it up by the dozens, as though repetition could somehow place her back where she belonged. It was the face her mother held while praying, the one her father studied, hoping to find something he had missed. Fear in her eyes, reluctance in her smile, a shadow behind her that might tell him where she had gone. Now, decades later, the corners are worn enough to curl, the paper thinned, soft from the oil of hundreds of hands. The black and white pigment is beginning to fail, softening the lines of her face. What remains is an impression of a girl, not entirely clear, but impossible to look away from. Sometimes, when you stare long enough, you start to believe she might speak. Her story has lived in silence for nearly 60 years. Not because people forgot her. No, those who love Lydia never let silence swallow her, but because nothing ever appeared to take its place. No answers. No sightings they could confirm. No proof of life. No body. Just a void. The unanswered kind. Narrators of true crime learn to fear that kind of absence. The kind that doesn't explain, doesn't confess, doesn't bury or resurrect. The kind that leaves a family suspended between hope and grief. Because when someone goes missing without a trace, there is no place to anchor sorrow. There is only imagination. And imagination is far more dangerous than confirmed tragedy. So this story begins not with a scream or a witness or a confession. It begins with quiet. A girl who smiled into a camera. A family who thought they understood the world. A town who believed nothing truly terrible could happen to one of their own. Lydia lived in Hickory Falls, Michigan, a place where futures were mapped out early, where people inherited not only land and houses, but patterns of living. In her photograph, you see none of the restlessness that lived inside her. You see only what the camera could record. The surface, the neatness, the way girls were taught to look pleasant for others. But somewhere inside that picture is a truth history failed to hold. The house behind her once smelled of coffee and wood polish. A narrow porch hugged the front, the boards creaking beneath the weight of anyone who crossed them. Her father built that porch the summer before this photo, nailing each board carefully as if he believed strong could keep his children close. Inside, their living room walls were lined with sewing patterns, small crucifixes, and shelves of books her mother adored. Her brother, only 12 then, spent his afternoons building makeshift rafts to float down the nearby creek. Life did not look like the kind that breaks suddenly. Her mother once said that Lydia had a way of listening to the world, to the creek, to the trees, to the wind coming off Lake Michigan, as if it all whispered secrets to her. She was not withdrawn. She simply felt life with a quiet intensity that made her seem older than her years. Teachers adored her. Boys admired her from a distance. Girls wished they could understand what lived behind her calm eyes. Yet in that photograph, the world around her is too still, too clean, too unaware that something irreversible was coming. This is how we meet her, not in the moment she vanished, but in the moment before, in innocence, in sunlight, in the naive belief that tomorrow would look just like today. Because when people disappear, the world remembers the last image that proved they were here. And for Lydia Mae Wallace, that proof is a simple photograph, a girl, a dog, a house, and the unbearable knowledge that shortly after was taken, she walked into history's quietest dark, leaving behind only questions. Even now, no one knows where she went, only that she never returned, and that somewhere buried beneath years and dust, a box waited, holding the first clue that would change everything. Hickory Falls wasn't the kind of place people left. It sat quietly in the lower part of Michigan, surrounded by farmland and pine groves that changed color to seasons. Green in summer, ash gold in fall, white and silent when winter came to claim everything. On maps, it barely registered. A town so small you could stand downtown and see where it ended. There was one diner, one hardware store, a church, a school, and a post office that doubled as the town's source of gossip. People there learned early that secrets didn't breathe for long. Life moved slowly. The air carried a mix of sawdust from the old mill, chimney smoke in colder months, and the faint sweetness of apple trees in the warm ones. In a place like Hickory Falls, you felt known before you even understood who you were. Teachers had taught your parents, and sometimes your grandparents. Neighbors waved before the sun rose, and strangers were so uncommon that seeing one felt like an event. The Wallace family lived near the edges of town, where the roads thinned and the fields stretched wider. Their home wasn't remarkable, but it was loved. Its white boards had begun to yellow from years of Michigan winters, but inside it felt safe. The windows rattled each time wind pushed through them, as if the house was reminding everyone it had been standing long before they arrived. Lydia shared a quiet, gentle bond with both her parents. Her mother, Doris, was a seamstress who worked from the kitchen table. Fabric swatches always stacked beside her teacups. She had soft hands and a voice that made even sorrow feel survivable. Lydia's father, Robert, worked long hours at the mill, a quiet man who expressed love through repair, fixing leaky faucets, squeaking doors, loose chair legs. He rarely spoke in grand gestures. He simply showed up every day without fail. To him, that was enough. Lydia's younger brother, Thomas, followed her everywhere when they were children. He had her quietness, but where Lydia observed, Thomas acted. He was restless and curious, constantly building things just to see if he could. She often watched him from the porch, calling out gentle encouragement when his experiments collapsed. Their connection wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real, the kind that settles deep inside a person. The town felt safe when Lydia was growing up. Children walked to school without fear. Doors stayed unlocked. People left their keys inside their cars. The police station, one story and always quiet, often had days with nothing more than stolen bicycles or barn cats that wandered too far. Crime was the kind of thing people heard about from other places, beyond a county line, through radio broadcasts. It belonged to someone else's world. Yet beneath all that stillness lived something no one talked about aloud, an undercurrent of watchfulness. Not danger, necessarily, but an awareness that everyone kept track of everyone else. Eyes followed. Stories circulated. In Hickory Falls, privacy came with limits. A person's business became town business in the space of a single afternoon run to the market. Some people found comfort in that closeness. Others, like Lydia, felt its weight. Even at 17, Lydia sensed she did not entirely belong to this place. While her friends dreamed of marrying boys from town or working where their mothers worked, Lydia spent her time imagining cities she had only read about. She devoured books about distant places, Coastal towns where the ocean met the sky. European cities lit like jeweled lanterns at night. Southern towns with music drifting through every street. She kept a notebook full of clipped magazine pages. Photos of mountains, cafes, strangers walking across bridges she could not name. Nothing extravagant, just glimpses of somewhere else. Still, she wasn't unhappy. She loved her family deeply. Loved the way the creek behind their house sounded just before dusk. Loved the quiet routines that shaped her life. But she felt something inside her, a soft pull toward the unknown. Like a thread tugged from somewhere beyond the horizon. She didn't know what it meant, only that it existed. To her parents, this restlessness looked like daydreaming, nothing more. They believed time would settle her, the way it had settled them. That one day she would choose someone from Hickory Falls, settle into a life that matched the familiar rhythm of the town. They weren't wrong to hope. They simply didn't know how deeply she felt that pull. At school, teachers praised her for her careful work and kindness. Her friends said she had a calming presence, even when she barely spoke. Some of the boys admired her, though she rarely seemed aware of it. She carried herself with a gentle certainty that made people notice her without fully understanding her. Church on Sundays was mandatory. Families filled the narrow pews, the air heavy with folded prayer leaflets and perfume. Lydia sat between her parents, eyes lowered, listening to sermons about obedience, faith, and modesty. She believed in goodness, but her connection of faith was quiet and internal, not loud or performative like many others in town. Sometimes, during hymns, she sang so softly only her mother could hear. The town, though peaceful, was not without unspoken boundaries. Girls were taught how to behave, how to present themselves, how to keep their voices small. Boys were given tools and told to use their hands. Girls were given rules and told to stay close. Tradition became the architecture of life, unchallenged, unquestioned. When someone stepped outside those expectations, the town noticed. Lydia hadn't broken any rules. Still, people sometimes whispered about her dreamy nature, her wandering mind. They didn't mean harm, but their curiosity felt intrusive, as though her soul were on display each time she walked into a room. Her mother tried to protect her from gossip, telling her to be herself, though she knew the world often punished gentle spirits. Her father, quiet as ever, simply made sure she had what she needed: a new coat when winters turned sharp, books she requested, even when money was thin. He never asked why she wanted them, just placed them on her bed like offerings. Hickory Falls held both safety and confinement. Those who loved it stayed forever. Those who didn't rarely found ways out. By the spring of 1964, something in Lydia had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that her parents noticed her lingering at the edge of conversations, watching the horizon with a tenderness that felt almost mournful. She walked longer than before, listened more closely to the creek, wrote more in her journal. There was a stillness in her, but also a quiet urgency. No one knew then what that meant. No one imagined it could be a warning. That summer, the world outside Hickory Falls roared. Civil rights marches, protests, music changing shape, people challenging rules once believed unshakable. Change echoed across the country. But here, the noise arrived only as distant radio chatter and newspaper headlines that felt like they belonged to another planet. Lydia read every word she could. Some said she looked different that year, more certain of something she never shared aloud. Her friends thought she might be in love. Her mother thought she was growing up. Her father thought she was drifting. And Hickory Falls, quiet as always, simply watched, unaware that its stillness was about to break. Because in a town where nothing ever changed, a single disappearance would become a wound that never truly healed. June 23rd, 1964, began the way most summer evenings in Hickory Falls did, unhurried, warm, with daylight stretching long past dinner time. The scent of lilac drifted across backyards, and the creek beyond the Wallace property shimmered beneath a fading orange sky. The heat from the day still clung to the earth, though a shy breeze carried the promise of cooler air. That night, nothing felt unusual. Inside the Wallace home, supper was eaten quietly. The sound of forks against plates, the hum of a small kitchen fan, and the soft murmur of conversation filled the room. Lydia helped her mother clear the table, stacking dishes with easy grace. Her brother sat on the porch steps outside, listening to crickets begin their nightly chorus. Her father lingered at the table a little longer than usual, staring absently at a local newspaper story about road repairs near the county line. He folded the paper without finishing the article and stepped out back to smoke, the tip of his cigarette glowing faintly in the growing twilight. At some point, almost casually, Lydia told her mother she needed to return a sweater she borrowed from a friend, Marianne, who lived 3 streets over, near the old elm trees that lined Maple Court. It wasn't strange. Girls borrowed clothes from one another all the time. Her mother asked if she wanted company, but Lydia shook her head with a soft smile. She had walked that route dozens of times before. She left the house with the same easy, calm scene in her photograph. Barely a trace of urgency, moving like someone who believed the world to be trustworthy. She wore a light summer blouse, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She didn't take her purse. She didn't take a coat, just a folded sweater held against her arm. Her mother watched from the window as Lydia walked down the road, the girl's figure shrinking against the lavender sky. A porch light flickered on across the street. A dog barked in the distance. Nothing in that moment suggested that it would be the last time she saw her daughter. The sun slipped lower as Lydia made her way through Hickory Falls. The town was peaceful, its small clusters of houses glowing softly under the first street lamps of the evening. Most families were finishing dinner or settling into their nightly routines. Radios played muted music from open windows. Somewhere, a father read aloud to a child. Somewhere else, teenagers sat on porches, whispering about summer dreams. As Lydia passed the old Baptist church, the bells chimed, a sound that normally blended with the town's background rhythm, but this time marked a point in her timeline that no one could ever unwind. It was 8 p.m. She reached Maple Court, but no one could later say for certain if she ever made it to Marianne's door. When Marianne was questioned days later, she said she never saw Lydia that night. She said she had not lent her a sweater recently. At first, police believed someone had remembered incorrectly, but as hours turned to days, Marianne's statement solidified. She hadn't expected Lydia. No one else on Maple Court reported seeing her either. Somewhere between her house and that quiet street, the world changed. Back at home, the Wallace family assumed everything was normal. At 9 p.m., Lydia's mother glanced at the clock but thought nothing of it. At 9:30, she began to wonder if the girls got caught up talking. At 10 o'clock, the air in the house shifted. Her mother felt something she could not name, an unsettled stirring, barely a thread of anxiety. Her father assumed she had stayed longer than expected and might be walking home. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking down the road. The night was still and humid. Fireflies flickered between the trees. By 10:30, that thread of anxiety tightened. Her mother phoned a friend, only to learn Lydia had never arrived. That was the moment everything inside her collapsed. Quietly, without spectacle, just a sudden plunge of understanding that something was deeply wrong. Her father grabbed his coat and headed toward Maple Court. He walked the route Lydia should have taken, calling her name every few minutes, his voice straining in the darkness. He knocked on doors. He asked anyone awake if they'd seen a girl walking. No one had. Neighbors joined him. Soon, a handful of townspeople moved through streets and backyards with flashlights, voices weaving through the stillness. Nothing. By midnight, the Wallace home was filled with a thrum of fear. Lydia's mother paced from window to window. Her brother sat on the living room floor, hugging his knees, trying not to cry. They waited for any sign. Footsteps on gravel, a knock at the door, even a phone call. But the night remained stubbornly silent. At 1:15 a.m., her father drove to the police station. Even then, officers hesitated. Teenagers ran away, they said. Young girls sometimes rebelled. Maybe she wanted to see a boy. Maybe she was visiting someone she hadn't told them about. But her father knew. He had felt the moment something changed, like an invisible line snapping in the dark. By morning, with no sign of Lydia, police finally took action. Search parties were organized. The creek behind the Wallace home was dragged. The fields were combed. Roadside were checked. The woods echoed with voices calling her name, but the only answer was bird song and the wind through leaves. Neighbors offered theories, none comforting. Maybe she'd sprained her ankle and couldn't get home. Maybe she got lost. Maybe someone picked her up. Some whispered darker possibilities, although no one dared speak them too loudly. Not here, not in Hickory Falls. The borrowed sweater, meant to be returned, was found days later inside Lydia's dresser drawer, folded, undisturbed. So why had she gone out that night? Police questioned the friend again, questioned her classmates, questioned anyone who might have known something. But nothing surfaced. The path that should have been simple, house to Maple Court and back, turned into a void. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, no torn clothing, no screams reported, no suspicious cars seen. She had simply evaporated. Rumors began their quiet dance through town. Some speculated she had a secret lover. Others believed she was planning to run away. A few whispered that maybe she had never left the house at all. Her mother clung to small details: the half-made bed, the hair ribbon she left on her desk, the chipped nail polish still on her fingers. These became objects of torment, proof that she intended to come back, proof that she didn't choose to leave. Her father went silent. The first 48 hours passed, then 72, and with every hour, hope thinned. People say that when someone goes missing, the world shrinks. But for the Wallaces, it expanded into terrifying emptiness. Every road became a threat, every stranger a suspect, every news report a reminder that the world was far bigger and darker than they had believed. Police brought dogs. They followed scents that led nowhere. Volunteers walked miles, searching every ditch, every abandoned shed. The town's newspaper printed her photograph on its front page. Local girl still missing. Her gentle smile stared back at everyone who bought bread or fuel or milk. No witnesses came forward. No body was found. No note. No clue. No reason. Only that she left on a short walk and never returned. In a town like Hickory Falls, where nothing ever happened, the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl was unthinkable. It cracked something in the town's foundation, a fracture that would never fully mend. June 23rd became a date people remembered not because of what they saw, but because of what they never would again. A girl stepping into the evening, unaware she was stepping out of the world known to her. And from that night on, the Wallace family lived in a darkness deeper than anything the absence of sunlight could create. A darkness made of unanswered questions. A darkness that would stretch across decades. It was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the town found itself suspended in a strange rhythm. People woke up every morning hoping to hear news about Emily, yet fearing what that news might be. Her house, once a place of gentle warmth, seemed frozen in time. Her bed remained untouched. Her shoes still rested beside the doorway. Her phone, sealed inside an evidence bag at the station, was a silent reminder of life interrupted. Her father, a quiet man who spent his early mornings in the backyard gardening, stopped tending to roses that Emily once helped him water. The petals wilted, browned, and fell one by one, as though the plants themselves were grieving. Neighbors tried to show support, dropping off food and doing small chores for the broken family. But grief had a way of building walls even around the kindest of hearts. At night, the family sat together in the living room, each pretending to be strong for the other, yet each feeling something inside them slowly fracture. Her younger brother would leave his bedroom door open, whispering her name in hopes she might whisper back. On the kitchen table lay a calendar stuck on the date she vanished, a reminder that time had chosen to move on, even though they could not. Outside the house, police searched tirelessly. Volunteers filled the woods with flashlights, their voices calling out into the dark as if she might step out from between the trees at any moment. The search area grew day by day: marshes, trails, riversides, abandoned barns. Dogs were brought in, deputies rode on ATVs, and drones scanned miles of forest canopy. But every evening ended the same: their return empty-handed. Faces streaked with sweat and discouragement, the weight of silence pressing heavily on their shoulders. Rumors began to take shape, like shadows cast across a wall. Some whispered that Emily had planned her disappearance, that she wanted a new life away from the suffocating quiet of her hometown. Others suggested something darker: a stranger passing through, a car pulling over, a scream swallowed by the night. At first, the police ignored the gossip, but as the days stretched into weeks, speculation started filling the gaps that evidence could not. The town changed. Parents no longer let their children walk to school alone. People locked their doors earlier. The feeling of safety, something everyone once took for granted, seemed to drain from the streets. Coffee shop conversations were no longer about weather or work. They were about theories, timelines, and suspicion. Old friendships strained under the weight of fear. Every face became a possible answer, and every answer only raised more questions. At the center of it all was a forest, the place where Emily was last seen. The locals spoke of it differently now, with a quiet reverence and a wary distance. Once a place where children played and couples wandered on quiet afternoons, it had transformed into a character of its own, watchful, unpredictable, and hiding secrets no one could unravel. The search finally slowed to a crawl. Volunteers returned to their jobs. The town tried to stitch itself back together. Yet the family's house remained unchanged, a still, silent reminder of a girl whose absence never stopped echoing. Though days continued to pass, Emily's story was far from finished. Everyone felt it. Her disappearance was not a closed chapter, only a pause before something far more unsettling would come to light. 2 months after Emily vanished, when most people had begun to move on, at least on the surface, the sheriff's department received a development that stirred the town awake again. It began quietly, almost too quietly to be real. A single photograph, emailed anonymously, sent to the police tip line in the dead of night. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a blurry image of a forest clearing, muted by grain and shadow. But when investigators zoomed in, they noticed a small figure sitting on the ground near a crooked tree. The outline was faint, the colors washed, yet the posture, the slouched shoulders, the tilt of the head, looked hauntingly familiar. Some swore it was Emily, others doubted. But what unsettled everyone was not the figure itself. It was the timestamp embedded in the corner. It was dated 11 days after she disappeared. Long after the search teams had swept the woods, long after they had assumed she was no longer anywhere nearby. The police could not verify the authenticity, but this single image rekindled an uneasy hope in the community, a fragile thread that many were afraid to hold on to. Soon after the photo surfaced, a pair of hikers came forward claiming they heard something strange while passing through the deeper trails of the same forest. They described it as a voice, thin, distant, and broken, calling for help. They thought it was an animal at first, until they heard it again. It sounded like a girl. They had tried to follow the sound, but the forest seemed to swallow it before they could reach the source. They returned to the trailhead, afraid they might stumble upon something they weren't prepared to find. When police organized a new sweep, the woods felt different. The trees, tall and old, stood in a dense, unbroken stretch that made sunlight struggle to reach the ground. Most of the searchers were familiar with these woods, yet each step felt foreign and wrong. The deeper they pushed, the more silence greeted them. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that presses against your ears and makes you feel watched. They marked trees as they walked, retracing areas they'd examined before, only to realize the landmarks seemed to shift. Trails they remembered felt altered, as if branches and paths had rearranged themselves in subtle ways. One deputy, exhausted and frustrated, said he found a strange circle of stones near a creek, a place he swore he had passed many times during the first search, but had never noticed before. The stones were arranged with odd precision, like someone had placed them intentionally, though there were no footprints, no disturbed ground, no signs of human presence. Some stones were covered in moss, others newly cleaned, as if recently touched. A few volunteers grew uneasy, whispering that someone might be living out there, someone who didn't want to be found. Over the next week, more odd reports surfaced. A local hunter claimed he found pieces of fabric snagged along a low branch, soft material pale blue, stained with dirt. Emily's mother identified it as the same color as the sweater Emily owned, though there was no way to confirm it. A jogger said she heard faint sobbing near the old quarry, but found nothing when she followed the sound. A group of teenagers, returning late from a camping trip, told police they saw a girl run across the road before disappearing into the brush, barefoot and silent, leaving only a scattering of fresh footprints too small for an adult. Rumors gathered force again, this time louder, harsher. Some insisted Emily was still alive, lost or held somewhere deep in the woods. Others believed the sightings were tricks of panic, imagination fueled by grief. Still, the forest became a subject of fear. No one visited it alone. Even seasoned hikers avoided the deeper trails. Police began setting motion cameras around the suspected areas, scanning for any sign of movement. Days passed with nothing. Then suddenly one night, one camera captured something. Only a flash of movement, faint and fast, crossing the frame. The figure didn't appear human. It moved too quickly, low to the ground, the shape distorted. The clip lasted less than a second, too short to make sense of. Some said it was just an animal. Others weren't so sure. Despite all these fragments, sightings, sounds, glimpses, nothing led to Emily. Every clue felt like a direction, yet every direction led nowhere. It was as if the forest offered hints only to pull them away again, leaving the town suspended between hope and dread. Something was happening out there. They could all feel it. But whatever truth waited beneath the branches remained hidden, and each unanswered question only deepened the quiet terror settling over the community. As the forest sightings grew stranger and more inconsistent, attention drifted away from the woods and towards something far more concrete. Something that could be held, examined, weighed. The box found in the Whitford family basement. At first, it sat quietly in the sheriff's office, sealed in an evidence bag, its presence overshadowed by the chaos outside. But with each dead-end search, each whispered rumor, the box began to take on a different weight. People who had never seen it spoke about it, as though it were alive. The object became a quiet gravity around which the story slowly began to orbit. The authorities returned to the Whitford home. They knocked gently, as though the walls themselves might shatter under the wrong tone. Emily's parents let them in without a word. The house felt smaller than before, not physically, but emotionally, shrinking inward like a wounded animal guarding its hurt. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn though it was noon. Dust floated in thin, quiet drifts, and every object, books, figurines, framed photographs, fell frozen in place, untouched since the night Emily vanished. The basement door still loomed at the end of the hallway. The sheriff, who'd seen countless crime scenes, felt a subtle unease as he descended the narrow stairs. There was nothing unusual about the space itself. Concrete floor, shelves of holiday decorations, a washer and dryer humming faintly. But the corner where the box had been found felt colder. It was not a place one avoided by reason, but by instinct, as if the house itself recoiled from it. The officers brought forensic specialists who dusted the floor, walls, and shelves for prints. They found almost nothing. No signs of forced entry, no clear footprints, no fingerprints except those belonging to the family and the officers who handled the box. Nothing to explain how something so old, so deliberately placed, could end up there without anyone noticing. The emptiness of evidence felt louder than any discovery. Emily's father tried to recall seeing the box before. He insisted it hadn't been there when he'd gone down to fix the water heater a month earlier. Her mother whispered that she never stored anything in that corner. They kept it clear because it was too damp. But the box showed no sign of moisture damage. Its wood felt dry, preserved, almost intentionally protected. Someone had placed it there with care. When the sheriff asked if they recognized the handwriting of a name carved into the lid, both parents stared at it as though it were a foreign word. The lettering was shaky yet intentional, uneven as if the blade had been pushed slowly, almost hesitantly, through the wood. The name, Emily, looked less like a label and more like confession. A historical specialist examined the container and estimated it was from the late 1800s or early 1900s, far too old to be connected to Emily directly. Its joints were hand-cut, its nails irregular, hammered by hand instead of machine. Someone had kept it for a long time. Someone had chosen to preserve it through generations. The question was why. Inside, below the keepsakes that had been logged into evidence, a burnt piece of ribbon, a faded photograph of a girl no one recognized, fragment of handwritten notes. Investigators found something overlooked, a thin layer of ash at the box's bottom. It smeared easily when touched, clinging to gloves like it had been waiting years to be disturbed. Lab analysis would later reveal that the ash came from burned paper, not wood. The photograph drew particular attention. It depicted a teenage girl, standing stiffly beside a farmhouse, her posture rigid. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, almost frightened. The image had yellowed, its corners curled. The sheriff lifted it against the light, studying the faint crease down the center. Behind the girl, half hidden by shadow, stood a large tree, crooked, twisting like a spine bent unnaturally. The same tree shape some thought they'd seen in the anonymous photograph of the forest clearing. The notes were harder to decipher. They had been fragmented, torn from a larger page. Only a few phrases were legible, written in a careful but uneven script. She said, "Follow. Beneath, when the light is gone, and not alone." These words did not clarify. They poisoned curiosity with new questions. Meanwhile, an archivist was enlisted to track the photo's origin. She returned a few days later with a strange finding. The farmhouse in the picture resembled one photograph in the 1920s in northern Michigan, near an area recently bought out and erased to build new roads. But the girl in the photograph was never identified, and records suggested that several children in that region went missing around that time. Their disappearances had never been solved. The longer the box was studied, the more its contents disrupted any easy narrative. The items seemed simultaneously connected and disconnected to Emily. They were too old, too obscure, too incomplete. Yet the name carved on the lid, the eerie echo of the photograph's background, made it impossible to dismiss. It felt as though the past had reached out and touched the present, leaving fingerprints no one could see. Rumors spread through Hollow Creek faster than facts. Some said the box had been buried beneath the house for decades and only surfaced now. Others believed that someone placed it there as a warning, or worse, a message. A quieter voice, shared only in the tightest circles, whispered something darker. That the box belonged to someone else long before Emily was born, and whoever belonged to might have come back for it. At night, Emily's mother began sleeping with the basement door locked, not for safety, but for peace of mind. She sometimes swore she heard faint creaking beneath the floorboards, though her husband insisted it was only the house settling. But she knew the difference. The sound was softer, irregular, like something shifting in the dark. The investigation, once straightforward, had become a spiral, instead of pointing toward a culprit. Each discovery widened the mystery. The box was no longer just an object. It was a doorway into something deeper, something threaded through time, through forgotten stories and unnamed girls, a secret buried quietly until Emily vanished. It was then, almost inevitably, that the sheriff made his choice, to look deeper, not just into Box's origins, but into the history of the town itself. An answer existed somewhere. It just wasn't in the present. It was buried in the past, waiting. The sheriff's decision to trace the box's origin felt, at first, like a grasp at thin air. But he sensed, not with logic, but with an instinct honed over decades, that this object was not an accessory to the disappearance. It was a message. Whether it came from the living or from the forgotten was unclear. But every thread he followed seemed to lead backward into a time when Hollow Creek was still a cluster of farms and dirt roads, before the brick church was built, before the factories arrived, before anyone thought about paving the ground. He began at the county archives, an aging building tucked behind the courthouse like an afterthought. The air inside smelled faintly of mildew and ink, and the shelves were stacked with documents no one had touched in years. A clerk named Marion, who remembered every file like it was a memory rather than paper, helped him search through records of local families. The Whitfords, remarkably, had almost no documented ties to the land beyond their grandparents. Their property, however, was different. According to old maps, the basement where the box had been found stood above what was once a small homestead owned by a family with a name no one recognized. Caro. The Caro name triggered a distant bell in Marion's memory. She recalled seeing it in an outdated census list, paired with a small notation: 3 children, none remaining. The line offered no explanation, just a grim finality. Marion sifted through brittle pages until she found what she was looking for: a brief article typed in a newspaper that had long since fallen out of print. The headline was terse and cold. Local children missing. Search continues. It was dated 1907. The article stated that 3 children from the Carroll family had vanished within a single week. No bodies had ever been found. No suspects identified. The mother and father, a quiet pair described as reclusive, abandoned the property shortly after and disappeared into obscurity. The farmhouse was left to decay. Years later, the land was sold, divided, and eventually rebuilt. Its past erased except in documents like these. No photograph accompanied the report, but the tone carried the same quiet dread that now surrounded Emily's case. The sheriff requested more details, but there were none. No follow-up articles. No handwritten notes. No recorded theories. It was as though the children had been swallowed by the land itself. Curiosity sharpened into unease. He drove to the local historical society, a cramped space kept alive by dusty photographs, faded maps, and a metal bell on the door that jingled with a tired spirit. An elderly curator named Eleanor greeted him with a polite nod. When he mentioned the name Carroll, her smile faded. She lowered her gaze and requested a moment. Behind a wooden door, he heard her sorting through boxes, papers shifting like dry leaves. She emerged with a thin folder bound by twine. Inside were items that seemed unrelated at first. A hand-drawn map of the area from 1893, marking a crooked tree near a stream. A charcoal sketch of what appeared to be a farmhouse, and a small school attendance list where the names of the Carroll children were written, then abruptly crossed out. 3 lines, 3 names, 3 quiet endings. But the most unsettling object was a photograph. Sepia tone slightly blurred, it depicted a group of children, 8 or 9, standing outside a small schoolhouse. Most smiled shyly, but one girl stood apart, her expression somber, her body turned slightly away, her eyes distant, unfocused, as though looking not at the camera, but at something far behind it. The sheriff felt a chill as he compared this girl's face to the photograph from a box. The resemblance was unmistakable. If the photo truly depicted one of the Carroll children, then the box and its contents were more than coincidence. It meant that someone, perhaps even someone who lived long after a time, had kept the memory of these missing children alive and tied it, inexplicably, to Emily. Still restless, the sheriff reached out to the oldest residents of Hollow Creek. Most had never heard of the Carrolls. Their family tragedy had been lost to time. But one man, Harold Finch, 92 and stubbornly proud of his memory, recalled a story his grandfather once told him. According to Harold, the Carroll children were said to wander the woods at night, following strange lights near the creek. His grandfather claimed that one of the girls had spoken of a voice calling her name from beneath the ground. They believed it was a game until one morning. The children stopped coming home. The sheriff tried to dismiss the tale as folklore, but Harold insisted, his voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but with conviction, that sometimes at night, even decades later, people heard children's laughter drifting through the woods where no children lived. Most brushed it off as owls or wind, but Harold said he knew the difference. They sound lost, he whispered, like they never made a home. The sheriff took these words back to the Whitford property. At dusk, he stood behind the house, looking toward the tree line. The air was cool, the grass bending under a gentle wind. The woods loomed, dark and indifferent. He tried to imagine what it was like in 1907. No paved roads, no streetlights, just the land and whatever lived in it. A century was not long enough to forget certain things. Then, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name, he approached the basement window. It was small, clouded by dust. Kneeling, he peered inside, seeing only shadows and a faint outline of shelves. But there was something else, a shape, or perhaps just a suggestion of one, in the far corner. He told himself it was nothing, just tricks of afternoon light, but unease pulsed quietly beneath his ribs. Inside the house, he asked permission to examine the basement again. Emily's mother agreed, her face pale with exhaustion. As he descended the steps, the air felt heavier than before, as though the house did not want him there. He moved toward the corner where the box had been found. The concrete floor was clean, but something about the space felt wrong, as though an absence still lingered like a shadow. Running his hand along the wall, he felt an unevenness, an outline faint but deliberate. Brickwork concealed an older shape. He tapped it lightly. The sound echoed differently than the rest of the room, hollow instead of solid. He stepped back, heart sinking. The wall had been rebuilt at some point. Not recently, but long enough ago that the current owners had no idea it wasn't original. Something had once been sealed here, and for the first time since the case began, the sheriff felt that the answer might not lie in who took Emily, but in what had been waiting for her long before she was born. The sheriff did not sleep that night. His mind wouldn't allow it. The discovery of the altered basement wall felt like a shift, an unseen hand finally moving a piece on a board he hadn't realized he was standing on. He lay in bed, replaying the hollow tap of his knuckles, the dull echo that seemed to answer him like a voice returning from the past. Something had been sealed there, something someone wanted forgotten. By sunrise, he was back at the Whitford house, this time with a small team and official permission to examine the basement more deeply. Emily's parents watched from the doorway, her father tense and silent, her mother gripping her own arms as though holding herself together. Dust followed the men down the staircase as they carried equipment. Portable lights, chisels, a small mallet. The lights illuminated the walls clearly, harsh and unflinching, revealing just how crudely the bricks in that section had been laid. Though old, they weren't as old as the foundation. The mortar was uneven, the color slightly off. Someone had sealed this corner decades after the house was built. The first brick took effort to remove. When it slipped free, a cold rush of air seeped out, stale, lifeless, untouched. It carried no scent of rot, only the strange neutrality of a space forgotten. As more bricks were loosened, the outline of a small cavity took shape, barely large enough for a grown man to crawl into. Light revealed a narrow recess, 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, like a shelter built for a person who never stepped out again. Inside, the walls bore faint markings, not words but scratches. They crisscrossed in chaotic patterns, like someone had dragged metal or bone across the concrete. Some lines curved sharply, forming loops, others straight and jagged. Ordinary tools could not have made them. The grooves were too deep, too deliberate. At the far end of the cavity, a wooden panel leaned slightly open. It matched the box in color and age. It was stained with time. The sheriff crouched, reaching for the panel. When he touched it, splinters flaked off like dry skin. Behind it was a small alcove no bigger than a cabinet shelf. There, half buried under dust, lay 2 more items, a rusted key and a tightly rolled piece of cloth secured with twine. He collected them carefully, placing them in evidence bags. The cloth was delicate, its fibers frayed. It looked like a torn piece of a child's dress, pale blue, eerily similar to the scrap found in the forest. The key was unusual, old, iron, with a handle shaped like a flower. The head was worn smooth by fingers long gone, its teeth uneven. It did not seem meant for a modern lock. The sheriff wondered if it belonged to the farmhouse in the old photographs, or to something else entirely. The cloth, when unwrapped, revealed a small embroidered name near its edge, faded but still legible, Lilith C. The sheriff felt a prick of recognition. One of the Caro daughters was named Lillian Caro. Lilith C. Could the stitching be shorthand? A childhood mark? The thread was red, the letters childish, uneven, done by an unsteady hand. Whoever stitched them wanted the world to remember her name, at least in some small way. As the team finished clearing the cavity, they found no bones, no human remains. No answer, only the remnants of a secret that someone had gone to great lengths to seal away. The sheriff tried to imagine what it meant. Did the Carroll family build this? Did the Whitfords' predecessors discover something they wanted to bury? Or had someone, more recently, come to this basement and quietly entomb the past again? The sheriff collected the items and stepped away. The walls around him seemed to pulse with tension, as if the house itself held breath. He closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself. When he opened them, he noticed Emily's mother at the top of the stairs, pale and trembling. She was staring not at him, but at the cavity they had opened, the black mouth in the wall that had rested beneath their feet for generations. She whispered, barely audible, "I don't want to hear." Her husband put an arm around her, but his eyes, too, were filled with fear. The team sealed the basement and left the family alone. The sheriff returned to his office, where he examined the items again under better light. The iron key sat cold and heavy in his palm. The shape of the flower felt symbolic. Delicate beauty cast in unforgiving metal. Under magnification, he noticed faint notches along the handle, almost like tally marks, carved hurriedly, unevenly. 5 grooves, then 2, then a large gap, then 1. He wondered if they represented dates, ages, or something more personal. The cloth fragment was harder to face. Its softness contrasted violently with its dark story. It carried a faint scent, not mold, not dust. Something sweet, almost floral, but aged beyond recognition. He held it close. The smell felt distant yet familiar, like a ghost of a memory that belonged to someone else. He imagined the little girl who wore it, her thin fingers threading the needle to claim her name, her place, before someone erased her from the world. He thought again about the scratches on the recess walls. He compared them to photographs of natural erosion, tool marks, clawing. They did not match. Some grooves curved in repeated patterns, almost rhythmic, like the beginning of symbols never completed. Others jagged, as if done in panic. He zoomed in on one particularly deep mark, noticing its edge was chipped in a way that suggested it wasn't made all at once, but over time, repeated strokes building into depth. Whoever made these marks had been trapped there long enough to leave evidence of their desperation. This realization unnerved him. If the cavity was built long after the Carroll children vanished, then who or what had been inside? And why were the items tucked neatly away, as though placed with intention rather than discarded? The sheriff thought about the farmhouse in the old photograph, the crooked tree, the unnamed girl staring into the lens with hollow eyes. He imagined that house decades ago, quiet, lonely, the woods wrapping around its edges. He thought about the rumors, the stories of children following lights at night, of voices beneath the ground. For the first time, he wondered if the disappearance of the Carroll children wasn't just a tragedy, but a cycle. The next step seemed obvious. He needed to find where the Carroll farmhouse once stood. The map from 1893 marked it. Roads had changed, but the land had not. If the basement concealed one secret, the land where the farmhouse once stood might hold the others. He planned a search, feeling the weight of the iron key in his pocket like a heartbeat. But that night, as he sat alone in his office, staring at the basement photographs, something happened. The lights flickered, once, then twice. Papers rustled though no window was open. The air seemed to settle into a dense quiet. From the evidence table, the cloth scrap slipped off its plastic bag as if nudged by an unseen hand, drifting to the floor. When he bent to pick it up, he froze. He heard it, a faint sound, a whisper, not a word, more like a soft exhale, a sigh pressed through the walls. He remained still, breath held, eyes scanning the room. Nothing moved. No one stood nearby. But the whisper had been real. Not loud, but close. Close enough to feel. He stayed there a moment longer, heart steady but cold, then carefully placed the cloth back into its bag. He locked the room behind him before leaving, though he knew no lock could truly keep the past contained. Outside, night waited. In the distance, beyond the dim town lights, the woods stood silent and dark. But something inside them was awake. The sheriff could feel it, an unseen presence walking in parallel with him, watching, waiting. The deeper he stepped into this mystery, the more he felt certain that the answers weren't simply hidden, they were alive, and they had been waiting a very long time. The next morning, the sheriff drove north, toward the quiet fields where the Carroll farmhouse once stood. The road thinned the farther he traveled, houses drifting apart like breaths, replaced by acres of empty land. The world felt wider here, older, untouched by the urgency of modern life. Trees lined the horizon in crooked spines. The sky stretched colorless and cold, as though the light itself hesitated to touch the ground. He followed the 1893 map, adjusting his path as he compared each bend of the road to the lines drawn by a hand more than a century old. He passed a rusted sign half swallowed by weeds, its lettering faded, private. The metal sagged under the weight of disuse, as if time had given up trying to erase it. Beyond the sign lay an open field, long abandoned. He pulled his car to his shoulder and stepped out. Silence greeted him. Not the peace of nature, but a stillness so sharp it seemed to listen. He began crossing the field. Grass brushed against his boots, whispering in faint rattles. The wind barely stirred. Something about this place felt suspended, like everything here was waiting for what he did not know. According to the map, the Carroll farmhouse had stood near a line of trees bordering the land. As he approached, he saw fragments of stone peeking out from beneath moss, the outline of a foundation long surrendered to time. Only a rectangle of stones remained, like a grave with no name. Kneeling, he brushed away dirt. His fingers found charred with beneath the soil, fragments that crumbled at his touch. It struck him that the house might have burned. Records never mentioned a fire, but history often forgot what fear demanded it bury. He closed his eyes, imagining the home that once stood here. Wooden walls, a narrow porch, a crooked tree casting a long shadow. The image felt too vivid, as though the memory belonged not to imagination but to the land itself. Behind the foundation, the crooked tree from the photograph still stood, twisted and monstrous, its branches reaching outward like fingers bending at uncomfortable angles. Its bark was dark, scarred, patched with thick moss. The tree seemed to tilt, leaning toward him as though acknowledging his arrival. The sheriff felt his stomach tighten. He approached it cautiously, noting the way its trunk spiraled as if grown in defiance of nature's logic. He lifted his eyes toward the highest branch. Something glimmered faintly, metal catching what little sunlight filtered through the clouds. It was a small wind chime, rusted and silent, hanging by a thin wire. He raised a hand and touched it. The metal was cold, unmoving. Only when he stepped back did it shift slightly, producing the faintest note, a single hollow tone that faded too quickly, stolen by air that shouldn't have been thick enough to hold it. At the base of the tree lay stones arranged in a half circle. The pattern was deliberate. He crouched, tracing the shapes with his gaze. They were old, some cracked, others worn smooth. Underneath them, the ground seemed looser, disturbed. He slid his fingers into the dirt and felt the earth give. Digging slowly, he uncovered a small metal tin, rusted shut. He turned it in his hand. The lid bore faint markings, scratches like those in the Whitford basement cavity. He pried it open. Inside, lined in cloth, was a single object, a child's button made of pale ceramic, embossed with tiny flower. On the underside, for letters had been scratched into the surface. L, C, R, W. The letters echoed like a whisper. Lilith Carroll. The sheriff stared at the tin, his pulse heavy. Why had this been buried here, beneath the crooked tree? And why was the button preserved, wrapped in cloth like something precious? Before he could stand, a sound drifted from deep within the trees. A short, broken exhale, almost like a sob caught halfway out of throat. He rose slowly, muscles tightening. The sound came again, faint and distant, but unmistakably human. He stepped toward it, pushing through brush and vines. Each step fell harder than the last, as though the forest resisted him. Branches snagged his coat, roots twisted beneath his feet. The path dissolved, replaced by a chaos of leaves and shadow. He stopped, listened. The sobbing ceased, replaced by the eerie quiet he'd felt before, an emptiness that seemed to pulse, alive without sound. He called out, voice steady, commanding. His own words sounded wrong here, too solid, too human. Nothing answered. Only the wind responded, brushing past it with a cold breath that felt almost intentional. Then he noticed something else. The forest ground bore no fresh footprints. Not from children, not from hikers, not from animals. He stood in a place where the earth remembered nothing or refused to. Turning back, he realized the crooked tree was no longer visible. He must have crossed farther than he thought. He scanned the environment, feeling a slow unease crawl into his bones. The silence broke again, this time with laughter. Faint, distant, a sound like children playing. He froze. The laughter carried no joy. It was thin, brittle, stretched across the air like a tear in fabric. He felt his breath catch. He listened as the laughter drifted between the trees, shifting in direction as though the children moved unseen, circling. His hand went instinctively to his holster, though he knew no weapon could answer the question screaming quietly through this place. He called out once more. The laughter stopped abruptly, as if swallowed by the forest. Then, from behind him, a voice spoke, soft, a girl's whisper. "Wait!" He spun around. Nothing stood there. Leaves rustled at his feet, though no wind blew. Heart pounding, he started retracing his steps, forcing calm. He moved quickly, pushing toward where he believed the field waited. But the forest offered no exit easily. Trees seemed closer than before, growing against his path, as if guiding or trapping. Just as panic threatened, he saw the crooked tree through a veil of branches. Relief shook him. He stepped into the clearing, breathing deeper. The sky looked lighter here. The wind chime hung motionless. The stones lay undisturbed, the tin still in his hand. He felt eyes on him, though no one watched. He stepped away from the tree, intending to leave, when he noticed something carved into the trunk, so faint he hadn't seen it before. He leaned closer. Letters, etched deeply, yet softened by age, E.B. 1964. Emily's initials. And her year. His chest tightened, breath leaving him. This carving had been made long before she disappeared, and long before she was born. The same year she vanished now marked a tree that might have stood here a century. Time should not allow such a thing. Beneath the initials was a short line of words, nearly erased by weather. "She hears you." The sheriff staggered back. For the first time, he felt something beyond fear, a certainty that whatever had taken the Carroll children still walked this land. It had waited beneath roots and stone, beneath soil and time. And now it had heard Emily. Or she had heard it. He left the clearing quietly, never turned his back to the crooked tree. The tin felt heavier in his hand, the button inside cold as bone. He walked until he reached the field, not breathing fully until his car came into view. Only then did he realize his hands were shaking. Driving back, he could not forget the whisper behind him. The voice had sounded young, fragile, familiar, like someone who once trusted he would come. Like Emily. The trial began in March of 1966, nearly 2 years after Emily vanished, inside a courtroom too small for the crowd that gathered. The air felt heavy, thick with breath, perfume, sweat, and the weight of unspoken blame. Wooden benches overflowed. Some sat on the floor. Others stood against the walls. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when truth might finally reveal itself, though most sensed it would never be that simple. At the front sat Richard Hale, not in the dusty uniform so many had known him by, but in a stiff gray suit that made him appear older, fragile even. His hands rested flat on the defense table, but his fingers trembled slightly, as if straining to hold something inside. His eyes, once stern and certain, now looked dull and defeated. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. Not the prosecution, not the families, not even his own son, who sat near the back. The prosecution presented their story with icy confidence. A respected father, burdened with debt and emotional strain, lashed out at the girl his son adored, a girl who had become like family. Something went wrong, panic, not intention, but fatal nonetheless. He hid the evidence. He waited, and when the town started to talk, he buried her deeper, letting silence protect him. They claimed the box in the basement was not an heirloom, but a container meant to transport memory. Because memory, they argued, is the heaviest thing to escape. They used Daniel's remembered confession as their spear, waving it like a banner of certainty. But memory is not a straight line. It bends, rewinds, warps. The defense countered that Daniel was manipulated, frightened, traumatized by guilt and grief. They argued that Emily had been like a daughter to Hale, that he had no motive to harm her. The hair in the box could have been placed there long before. The photo of the woods was never proven authentic. And without a body, without forensics, without a single indisputable piece of evidence tying Hale to Emily's disappearance, the defense insisted this was not justice. It was desperation dressed up as righteousness. Witnesses were called, neighbors, relatives, old friends. Some described Hale as gentle, patient, a man who helped fix engines for free and shovel snow for the elderly. Others painted him as strict, easily angered, a man who believed silence was virtue and tears were weakness. Mrs. Wallace, Emily's mother, took the stand. She spoke with shaking hands, but her voice was strangely steady. She remembered Hale as kind, helpful, someone who brought groceries when she struggled. She admitted she never feared him until the night her daughter disappeared. The courtroom hung on every word, waiting for her to condemn him, absolve him, anything. But she ended quietly. "I don't know." 3 soft syllables that divided the room like a knife. Daniel testified, too. He seemed older than his years, worn by the trials inside his own mind long before he stepped into that witness box. He spoke carefully, painfully. He described flashes, his father telling him to forget what he'd seen, to go to his room, a noise in the basement, a dull panic. But then Daniel faltered. He admitted he didn't see his father hurt Emily. He only remembered fear. He said he didn't know if his memories were real or dreams, if they were things he witnessed or things planted by others. His words, once treated as truth, now dissolved into uncertainty. The courtroom shifted, some leaning forward, others deflating back. Then came the expert witnesses. A psychologist explained how children, especially teenagers under stress, can misremember events, especially when guided, intentionally or not. Memories, he said, do not record, they reconstruct. Another expert countered, saying trauma often sharpens memory, even if words fail. The back and forth felt endless, heavy, circular. People wanted clarity. They got fog, without a body. The prosecution leaned hard on the box found in the Hale basement. They repeated its presence like a mantra. Her hair, her ribbon, the fabric that matched her last outfit. The defense argued the items could have been keepsakes or planted. Hale himself never touched the box in court. He only looked at it once, briefly, with an expression no one could decode, mourning, fear, guilt, or something else entirely. When Hale finally chose to speak, the courtroom froze. His voice was quiet, threaded with exhaustion. He denied hurting Emily. He said she was like family, that he would have given his life for her. He admitted he told Daniel to stay quiet that night, but it was because Daniel had seen something in the woods late and came home trembling. Hale believed his son was hallucinating, that speaking of it would create hysteria. He begged the court to understand. "I was trying to keep him safe from what he didn't understand, not from what I did." His words didn't sway everyone. Some whispered he was lying. Others saw a father fighting to protect a son who'd already been devoured by silence. In closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to trust the fragments, the memory, the box, the photo, the sightings. Together, they formed a shape, maybe not sharp but unmistakable. They argue that truth is often incomplete, but still true. The defense reminded the jury that shadows are not figures, that suspicion is not proof, and that grief can distort as much as it reveals. The jury deliberated for 36 hours. The town held its breath through the longest night it could remember. When the verdict was read, not guilty, the room erupted. Some cried in relief. Others shouted in rage. The Wallace family collapsed into each other, numb, as if the world had abandoned them again. Hale stood still, not triumphant, not relieved, only stunned. Daniel wept silently, head in his hands, unsure if justice had been defended or destroyed. The trial ended with no answers, only fractured truths. Emily remained missing. The box returned to evidence storage. The town, wounded and divided, tried to return to normal. But normal had long since slipped away, leaving only a quiet, uneasy knowledge. They might have freed an innocent man, or they might have released the only person who knew where Emily was. Either way, the truth remained buried, somewhere between the basement and the woods, between a boy's trembling memory and a man's exhausted denial, in the spaces where silence waits for the living to stop asking. In the months after the verdict, Cole Harbor lived in a strange, muted silence. Some people felt relief, others felt cheated. But beneath those reactions lay something deeper, exhaustion. They were tired of trying to understand what had happened to Emily, tired of pointing fingers, tired of fear. Richard Hale withdrew from the world entirely. He and his son Daniel moved to a small house on the edge of town. Curtains stayed drawn. The mailbox overflowed. Some claimed they saw Daniel wandering near the woods, staring into the trees like he was trying to remember something he had forgotten or trying to forget something he still remembered. Emily's mother shrank under grief. She kept a lamp burning every night, as if Emily still might return. People admired her resilience, yet no one truly understood her quietness. She no longer asked for answers. She seemed to know none were coming. Small stories resurfaced. Strange footprints in the snow, whispers near the river, a girl-shaped shadow at the tree line. Some said grief creates illusions. Others believed truth had begun to leak through the cracks again. Then, one morning, something shifted. Someone noticed the Hale house stood open. Its lock wasn't broken. The door simply stood ajar. Inside, everything was still. Clothes, kitchenware, the smell of old wood. But Richard and Daniel were gone. Their disappearance was clean, deliberate. No note, no struggle, just absence. Only one thing remained, a single photograph of Emily sitting on the basement shelf. It hadn't been there before. Cold Harbor felt the same dread to the night Emily first went missing. Some tried to ignore it. Others whispered that the Hales hadn't fled. They had followed something. Whatever had begun years earlier hadn't ended. It had simply waited. Nearly a decade passed. Cold Harbor learned to live with unfinished stories. But the Hale house stood frozen in time, abandoned, quiet, waiting. A renovation crew purchased the property, planning to turn it into rentals. When they opened the door, the air felt colder than winter. The house looked preserved, almost staged. Dust covered everything. Yet the basement door was nailed shut, as though someone wanted to keep whatever was below from rising. When the workers forced it open, they found only emptiness, too empty. No tools, not even shelf marks on the walls. Just a square board in the floor, sealed with metal brackets. A trapdoor no one expected. That night, a young worker named Tobias returned alone, curiosity outweighing fear. He pried the boards up and found a hidden cavity, and inside, a small wooden box. He opened it. A pale ribbon. A photo of a girl by the creek. A note. She went where she belonged. Do not follow. Then a sound, soft, broken. Somewhere behind him. Help me. He fled. When others returned, the trapdoor was closed and the cavity was empty. Tobias quit the job and refused to speak of it again. Soon after, a local archivist uncovered records suggesting disappearances stretching back decades. Always a young girl, always near the forest, always a box. She tried to bring her findings forward, but fear muted her. Weeks later, she left town without warning. Her house remained furnished, untouched. Locals began hearing whispers near the woods. Some glimpsed a pale figure among the trees. One man claimed she turned toward him, as if listening. Before he could speak, she stepped into fog and vanished. Cold Harbor returned to silence. But everyone felt it. Some stories don't end. They return,